It's New Year's Eve, 1984. In a matter of seconds, a 21-year-old rock drummer is going to lose his arm on a quiet English road. What happens next will turn him into one of the most unlikely comeback stories in music history. He doesn't see it coming. Nobody ever does. Rick Allen grew up in Sheffield, England, in a working-class family where music wasn't a hobby. It was a lifeline. He found the drums early, and something about the rhythm just made sense to him in a way that words never quite could. By the time he was 15 years old, most kids his age were worrying about exams and curfews. Rick was already sitting behind a drum kit in a real band, playing with musicians. Miriam survives the crash with a head injury, dazed but alive, pulled from a nightmare she never saw coming. Rick lies nearby, barely conscious, his body already beginning to shut down from blood loss, the adrenaline doing just enough to keep him from fully understanding what's happened to him. And then, almost as if the universe still has a plan for him, help arrives. A local nurse happens to be driving past. Then another. A policeman spots the wreckage from the road and pulls over immediately. On a day when most people in Sheffield are indoors, wrapping up errands before the New Year's countdown, three strangers happen to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. They find Rick barely breathing. When the ambulance crew finally reaches him, one of the first things said at the scene is something close to disbelief. He's still alive. Given the severity of what's happened, given how much blood he's lost lying in that cold field, it's not something anyone can take for granted. He's rushed to the hospital, and what follows next is a blur that Rick himself will later admit he can barely remember. Surgeons manage to do something remarkable. They reattach his severed arm, piecing it back on his body in a delicate, painstaking operation that gives him, for a brief window of time, real hope that he might walk away from this with everything intact. For a few days, it seems to be working. Rick drifts in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to recover from trauma that would have ended most people's stories completely. He doesn't fully grasp what's happened to him yet. He's not putting the pieces together. He simply exists in that strange, suspended space between sleep and waking, unaware that his life is about to take another brutal turn. Because reattaching an arm in a hospital operating room is one thing. Keeping it alive inside a body already weakened by trauma is another. An infection sets in. It's the kind of complication that happens quietly, invisibly, deep beneath bandages and stitches, while doctors and nurses do everything they can to hold back what's coming. But infection doesn't negotiate. And by early January, just days after the crash that should have already killed him, doctors are forced to make an impossible decision. The arm has to come off. On January 4th, 1985, surgeons amputate what's left of Rick Allen's left arm, this time permanently, this time with no possibility of putting it back. He is not even conscious to make the decision himself. He simply wakes up one day, weeks after the accident, to find that a piece of himself is gone. For a drummer, an amputation isn't just a physical loss. It's the loss of the exact tool that built his entire identity. Drumming isn't something Rick does. It's something he is. And now, the arm that spent years pounding out rhythms in front of screaming crowds around the world is simply not there anymore. When the reality finally settles in, something in Rick breaks in a way that has nothing to do with bone or muscle. He doesn't want to see anyone. He doesn't want visitors, doesn't want sympathy, doesn't want the pitying looks he imagines waiting for him outside that hospital room. The only people he can bring himself to want near him are his brother and his parents. The people who knew him before any of this, before the fame, before the fans, before a single moment on a wet road took so much from him at once. He wants to disappear. It's a feeling most people can understand on some level, even if they've never lost a limb, even if they've never faced a moment where the future they'd built for themselves simply vanishes. That specific kind of grief, mourning a version of yourself that no longer exists, is one of the loneliest places a person can be. And for a while, it seems like that's exactly where Rick is going to stay. But something starts to shift. Letters begin arriving at the hospital. Then more. Then even more, pouring in from fans all over the world who've heard what happened and refuse to simply write him off. Strangers, people who've never met him, taking the time to tell him that they're rooting for him, that his story matters, that whatever comes next, he isn't facing alone. And closer to home, his bandmates make a decision that will end up defining the next chapter of both his life and theirs. They don't replace him. In an industry built on relentless forward motion, where record labels expect albums on schedule and tours to stay on track no matter what, Def Leppard makes the choice to wait. They believe in him, even when he isn't sure he believes in himself anymore. They give him room to heal, room to grieve, room to figure out whether there's still a way forward for a one-armed drummer in a business that has never had to answer that question before. Rick leaves the hospital on January 29th, 1985, less than a month after the accident that should have ended his career completely. It's a fragile kind of freedom, walking back out into a world that now looks completely different than it did the last time he saw it. And barely 3 weeks later, on February 22nd, he's back with the band at Whistler Studios in Holland. It's one thing to survive. It's another thing entirely to walk back into the room where your old life used to happen and try to figure out how to build a new one inside it. Because here's the real question nobody has an answer to yet. How exactly does a drummer play drums with only one arm? There's no manual for this. No blueprint. Drumming, at its core, relies on two hands working in constant, complicated coordination, hitting different surfaces at different times to create the layered rhythms that hold an entire song together. Rick doesn't have that option anymore. And for months, it seems entirely possible that his career really is over. But then he meets someone who refuses to accept that as the final answer. A local Sheffield electrician named Pete Hartley starts working with Rick on custom foot pedals, engineering a way for Rick's legs to take over some of the work his missing arm used to do. It's slow. It's frustrating. It's an entirely new language for a body that spent years knowing exactly how to make music. Alongside this, drum manufacturer Simmons begins developing something that's never existed before, an electronic drum kit specifically built for Rick's body, a system where certain drum sounds can be triggered by foot pedals instead of hands, freeing his one remaining arm to cover parts of the kit that used to require two. It's part machine, part willpower, and entirely unprecedented. Rick spends months relearning an instrument he'd already mastered once, except this time, everything he thought he knew has to be rebuilt from scratch. Every song Def Leppard had ever written has to be reimagined, broken down, and reconstructed around a completely different physical reality. There are days it feels impossible, days when frustration threatens to undo months of progress in a single session. But slowly, painfully, something starts to click. He remembers what it felt like that very first time a rhythm came out right, when his body and this strange new kit finally worked together instead of against each other. It isn't the same as before. It will never be exactly the same as before. But it's real. It's music, and it's coming from him again. And on August 16th, 1986, less than 2 years after a car crash left him fighting for his life in a field outside Sheffield, Rick Allen walks back out onto a stage. The show is the Monsters of Rock Festival at Castle Donington, England, in front of a massive crowd that has no idea what they're truly about to witness. When the lights hit him and the first song begins, and people realize this is really happening, that the drummer they'd all read about, the one who lost his arm, the one many assumed was finished, is actually up there playing, the reaction is something close to disbelief mixed with pure emotion. He isn't just performing. He's proving something, not just to the crowd, but to himself, to every doctor who ever doubted this was possible, to every version of himself that spent those early hospital days wanting to disappear. From that night forward, Rick Allen doesn't just remain a member of Def Leppard. He becomes a symbol, proof that catastrophic loss doesn't have to mean the end of who you are, that reinvention, however brutal and however slow, is always possible if you're willing to fight for it. He goes on to perform with Def Leppard for decades afterward, touring the world, recording new albums, standing behind that custom kit night after night in front of audiences who came specifically to see him defy what everyone once assumed was impossible. Somewhere along the way, he even finds himself able to incorporate elements of acoustic drumming again, blending old techniques with a new system he spent years perfecting. But maybe the most powerful part of his story isn't the comeback itself. It's what he chooses to do with it. Rick eventually founds the Raven Drum Foundation, a charity built around helping trauma survivors, including veterans and struggling young people, use rhythm and drumming as a path toward healing. He takes the very thing that once nearly destroyed him and turns it into something that helps other people survive their own worst days. Decades later, when people ask him whether he'd go back and change that one moment on the road, whether he'd erase the crash if he somehow could, his answer isn't the one you might expect. He doesn't talk about anger or regret. He talks about growth, about how something that should have ended his story instead became the thing that gave his life a deeper purpose than fame alone ever could have. What happened to Rick Allen on that quiet English road in 1984 was never supposed to be survivable, let alone something a person could build an entire second chapter of greatness on top of. But he did. And every single time he sits behind that drum kit, decades after doctors told him his career was almost certainly over, he isn't just playing music. He's proof that the worst moment of your life doesn't get the final say in who you become.